The morning sun peeked through the clouds as Zara Johnson walked briskly down the street. She checked her watch, 7:15 a.m. Perfect. She loved getting to Bellamy Cafe early, before the morning rush turned it into a buzzing hive of business people and laptop warriors. The little bell above the door jingled as she pushed it open. The rich smell of freshly ground coffee beans wrapped around her like a warm hug. Zara nodded at Tommy, the barista who'd been serving her morning coffee for almost a year now. "The usual?" Tommy called out with a smile. "You know it," Zara replied, already pulling out her wallet. Tommy started preparing her order, a medium Americano with an extra shot and just a splash of oat milk. Zara had simple tastes, despite her rising success at work. She made her way to her favorite spot, a small corner table with a comfortable chair and a view of both the street and the cafe's interior. As she settled in, she couldn't help but feel a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Today wasn't just any day. At 28 years old, Zara was about to present her biggest pitch yet to a room full of potential investors. Millions of dollars for Horizon Innovations hung in the balance. She pulled out her laptop, not the newest model, but reliable, and opened the presentation she'd been fine-tuning for weeks. The familiar slides calmed her nerves. She knew this material inside and out. The market analysis, the projected growth, the innovative solutions her team had developed. It was all there, backed by solid research and creative thinking. Zara took a sip of her coffee as Tommy set it down. "Big day?" he asked, noticing her intense focus. "You could say that," she smiled. "Make or break, really." "You've got this," Tommy said with a thumbs up before heading back to the counter. Zara was dressed more casually than she would be for the actual meeting. Her favorite dark blue jeans and a simple white blouse were comfortable for these early morning prep sessions. Later, she'd change into the sharp charcoal suit hanging in her office. But for now, in this quiet morning moment, she could just be herself. The cafe began to fill up as the clock ticked toward 8 a.m. Business people in pressed suits, college students with textbooks, and local regulars all formed a line at the counter. Zara barely noticed. She was deep in her work, adding notes, reviewing key talking points, and mentally rehearsing answers to tough questions. As the youngest director at Horizon Innovations, Zara was used to proving herself. She'd graduated at the top of her engineering program and turned down offers from bigger tech giants to join Horizon, a growing company where she could make a real impact. In just 8 months, she'd transformed their struggling marketing division, bringing fresh ideas and bold strategies that caught the attention of the entire industry. Outside the window, the city was waking up. Cars humped in the distance. People hurried past with determination written on their faces. Inside, the hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine created a comfortable background noise that helped Zara focus. She highlighted a section on customer retention strategies and made a quick note. The investors would want more details here. She knew Mr. Chen, the lead investor, would ask about long-term projections. She added another slide with a graph showing potential growth over 5 years instead of 3. Zara checked her watch again. She still had another hour before she needed to head to the office. Plenty of time to perfect her pitch. She took another sip of coffee, now cooling, and allowed herself a moment of quiet confidence. She'd worked hard to get here. She deserved this moment, this opportunity. Little did she know that her peaceful morning was about to take an unexpected turn. Zara was halfway through her second cup of coffee when the cafe door swung open with more force than necessary. A cold draft swept through the warm space, causing a few patrons to look up from their conversations and laptops. Patricia Whitmore walked in like she owned the place. In her early 50s with perfectly highlighted hair cut in an expensive bob, she wore a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than Zara's monthly rent. A large designer handbag hung from the crook of her elbow, and oversized sunglasses sat perched on her head despite the cloudy day outside. The cafe had filled considerably in the last hour. Almost every table was taken, and a small line had formed at the counter. Patricia's eyes narrowed as she scanned the room, clearly unhappy with the lack of available seating. Her gaze landed on Zara in the corner, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Tommy was busy with the morning rush, so another barista greeted Patricia. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" "Medium flat white, no sugar, almond milk only," Patricia replied without looking at the barista. Her eyes were still fixed on Zara, who remained absorbed in her work, oblivious to the attention. Patricia tapped her manicured nails on the counter while waiting for her drink. When it arrived, she took a small sip, made a face as if it wasn't quite right, but said nothing. Instead, she marched toward the manager's small office at the back of the cafe. The manager, Rick, a soft-spoken man in his 30s who always seemed slightly overwhelmed, was checking inventory when Patricia knocked sharply on his open door. "Excuse me," she said, not waiting for an invitation to enter. "I need to speak with you about a problem." Rick looked up, recognizing one of the cafe's regular customers and one known for her complaints. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore. How can I help you today?" Patricia lowered her voice, but not enough to prevent nearby customers from hearing. "That person," she said, pointing toward Zora's corner, "has been hogging that table for over an hour. It's completely inappropriate." Rick peered around Patricia. "Ms. Johnson? She's a regular customer. She comes in most mornings." "Well, she's taking up a table meant for 4 people," Patricia insisted. "And she's just on her laptop. This isn't a library or a free office space." "She's purchased multiple drinks," Rick explained gently. "We don't have a time limit for customers who are buying." "Look," Patricia cut him off, her voice growing louder. "I have friends joining me shortly, and that corner table would be perfect. Surely you can ask her to move to a smaller table or take her little computer games elsewhere." Rick shifted uncomfortably. Patricia was known to leave scathing online reviews when displeased, and the cafe owner had previously instructed him to keep the peace with difficult customers. With a resigned sigh, he followed Patricia towards Zora's table. Several customers watched the scene unfold, some exchanging glances of discomfort. Zora, deep in concentration, didn't notice their approach until Rick cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, miss," he said quietly, avoiding eye contact. "But we've had a complaint about the space you're occupying. Apparently, it was reserved." Zora looked up, confusion crossing her face. She'd been coming to this cafe for months and had never seen a reservation system in place. She glanced around the table for any sign or marker indicating it was reserved. "I've been sitting here for over an hour," she replied, bewildered. "And I've never needed a reservation before." Patricia stepped forward, positioning herself beside Rick. "This cafe has standards," she said loudly enough for nearby patrons to hear. "Some people clearly don't understand that certain establishments aren't meant for everyone." The cafe fell silent. A barista behind the counter froze mid-pour. Tommy looked over with concern from where he was wiping down the espresso machine. The weight of Patricia's words hung in the air, words that said everything without saying anything explicitly. Zora's fingers hovered over her keyboard as she processed what was happening. The presentation on her screen, once so important, suddenly seemed very far away. Zora felt a heavy weight settle in her chest as Patricia's words echoed through the now-silent cafe. She'd been in situations like this before, moments when someone didn't say anything directly racist, but made their meaning crystal clear to everyone listening. The familiar burn of embarrassment and anger warmed her cheeks. She took a deep breath, counting silently to 5 like her mom had taught her to do since she was a little girl. "Don't let them see you upset," her mother would say. "That's what they want." Zora closed her laptop slowly, buying time to compose herself. The investor presentation that had seemed so important just minutes ago now felt distant and unimportant compared to what was happening. "I'm a paying customer just like you," Zora said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "And I have every right to be here." She gestured to her empty coffee cups. "I've bought 2 drinks already this morning." Patricia scoffed, adjusting her designer handbag on her arm. "People like you always play that card. The manager has asked you to leave, so I suggest you do so without causing a scene." A few tables away, an older man looked down at his newspaper, pretending not to hear. A young couple whispered to each other, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to get involved. The cafe had become a theater, and everyone was watching the show while trying to appear like they weren't. Tommy, who had been wiping down the same spot at the counter for the past minute, finally put down his cloth and started walking over. Rick, the manager, noticing this, held up his hand to stop him. "Perhaps we could find another table for you, miss," Rick suggested to Zora, his voice strained. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cafe's cool temperature. There's a small one by the window that just opened up. Zara looked at the tiny table he pointed to, barely big enough for her laptop and a coffee cup. She then looked back at her current spot in the corner, where she'd been sitting unproblematically for over an hour. "I don't understand," Zara said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Is there actually a reservation system here? Because I've been coming to this cafe for months, and I've never seen a reserved sign on any table." Rick wouldn't meet her eyes. "Well, no, we don't typically take reservations, but Mrs. Whitmore is a very valued customer," a nearby patron muttered just loud enough to be heard, finishing the unspoken part of Rick's sentence. Patricia smiled thinly at this, as if the comment confirmed her importance. "Some of us have been coming here for years," she said. "We support local businesses properly, not just take up space for hours on end." Zara felt a flash of anger. She'd been coming to this cafe 3 times a week for nearly a year. Tommy knew her order by heart. She always tipped well. She had even attended the cafe's anniversary celebration last month. "I support this business properly too," Zara said, her voice stronger now. "And you know what? I've never had a problem until today." She looked Patricia directly in the eyes. "I wonder what's different about today." The implication hung in the air. Patricia's face tightened, but she didn't back down. "Don't make this into something it's not," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "This is about appropriate behavior in a quality establishment, not whatever you're implying." An older woman at a nearby table slowly shook her head in disapproval, but it wasn't clear who she was disapproving of, Patricia or Zara. Rick shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Look, I don't want any trouble here." "Neither do I," Zara replied. "I just came here to work and have coffee, like I do several times a week." Just as Patricia opened her mouth to respond, the bell above the cafe door jingled. Cool morning air swept into the room, bringing with it a tall figure in a tailored gray suit. Zara hadn't expected to see him here. Not today of all days. Alexander Reynolds stepped into the cafe with the confidence of someone who was used to being noticed. At 45, he carried himself with the easy authority that came from building a tech company from the ground up. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his suit was expensive but not flashy. He paused just inside the door, letting his eyes adjust to the interior lighting as he scanned the room. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Even without knowing what was happening, Alexander could sense something was off. The cafe was unnaturally quiet, like a movie scene where someone had just dropped a bombshell and everyone was still processing it. Then he spotted Zara in the corner, with the manager and an older woman standing over her table. His face brightened instantly. "Zara," he called out, his voice breaking through the uncomfortable silence. "I thought I might find you here." Every head in the cafe turned toward him. Alexander paid no mind to the attention as he walked confidently through the maze of tables toward Zara. Several customers straightened in their seats, recognizing the CEO of Horizon Innovations. A few even nudged their companions and whispered behind their hands. "Mind if I join you?" Alexander continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "I'd love to go over those projections before the investor meeting." He pulled out the chair across from Zara and sat down before anyone could respond. Patricia Whitmore remained frozen in place, her mouth slightly open in mid-sentence. The color drained from her face as she watched the scene unfold before her. The designer handbag slipped from the crook of her elbow and dangled from her wrist, forgotten. Rick, the manager, looked like he might pass out. His eyes darted between Patricia and Alexander, unable to decide which customer demanded his attention more urgently. Zara, for her part, was struggling to hide her surprise. She'd planned to meet Alexander at the office later, not here in the cafe where she was just being asked to leave. "Mr. Reynolds," she managed to say, her professional tone a stark contrast to the heated discussion from moments before. "I wasn't expecting you until the meeting at 11. Alexander smiled warmly. "I know, but I was up early reviewing those market projections you sent over, and I had some thoughts." He pulled out his own sleek laptop from his messenger bag, completely unaware of the drama he'd interrupted. "Those numbers for the Asian market expansion look really promising. The board's going to eat it up." Tommy, watching from behind the counter, barely suppressed a grin as he caught Zara's eye. He gave her a small thumbs up before turning back to the espresso machine. Patricia remained rooted to the spot, her expression somewhere between shock and horror. She straightened her blazer in a nervous gesture, suddenly very aware of how the situation had completely flipped. "Would you like some coffee, sir?" Rick asked Alexander, finding his voice at last. "On the house, of course." Alexander looked up, noticing the manager for the first time. "No need for that. Just my regular Americano would be great, thanks." He turned back to Zara, but paused, finally registering the odd atmosphere. "Is everything all right? You seem tense." Zara glanced at Patricia, who was slowly backing away from the table. For a fleeting moment, Zara considered letting the whole thing drop. It would be easier to move on and focus on the meeting ahead. But something inside her, the same something that had gotten her through college and into the director's chair at Horizon, wouldn't let her stay silent. "Actually," Zara said, closing her laptop and folding her hands on the table, "something happened just before you arrived that I think you should know about." Patricia's retreat halted abruptly, and her eyes widened with panic. The cafe patrons, who had started to return to their own conversations, quieted once more, sensing that the real drama was just beginning. Alexander's expression turned serious as he looked between Zara and the hovering pair. "I'm listening," he said simply. Alexander leaned forward, his attention completely focused on Zara. He had always been a good listener. It was one of the qualities that made him such an effective leader. People felt heard when they spoke to him. "This lady," Zara began, gesturing toward Patricia, who was now fidgeting with her watch, approached the manager and insisted that I be removed from this table. She kept her voice steady, sticking to the facts. When I pointed out that I'm a paying customer, she made some comments suggesting that, well, that I don't belong in a place like this. Alexander's expression darkened as understanding dawned. He'd seen this before, not just in business but throughout his life. His own wife, who was black, had shared similar stories over their 15 years of marriage. "I see," he said quietly, the warmth in his voice replaced by something cooler. He turned in his chair to face Patricia directly. "And on what grounds did you think my colleague should leave her table?" Patricia's perfectly made-up face had gone from pale to blotchy red. She cleared her throat, smoothing down her already smooth pantsuit. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said, forcing a tight smile. "I simply noticed that a single person was occupying a larger table, and with the cafe being so busy." Her voice trailed off as she gestured vaguely around the room. Alexander glanced around. While the cafe was certainly busy, there were at least 2 other people sitting alone at 4-person tables. Tellingly, neither of them had been approached. "Is that so?" Alexander asked, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. Funny how these misunderstandings seem to happen to certain people more than others. Rick, the manager, looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. He kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting between Alexander and Patricia. "Mr. Reynolds," he began, "I didn't realize Ms. Johnson worked for you. We'd value all our customers, of course." "Do you?" Alexander cut in. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looked like you were asking a regular customer to move based on another customer's prejudice." The cafe had gone completely silent again. Even the hiss of the espresso machine seemed muted. 2 teenagers in the corner were not so subtly recording the exchange on their phones. Patricia clutched her handbag tighter. "I am a longtime patron of this establishment," she said, her voice higher than before. "I spend thousands of dollars here annually. I host my book club here every month." "I've been reviewing your presentation," Alexander said to Zara, deliberately turning his back on Patricia. "Brilliant work as usual. The board is impressed with how you've turned the marketing division around in just 8 months." The praise would have normally made Zara's day, but right now it felt like something else. A public acknowledgement of her value and position. Alexander was making a point, not just to Patricia but to everyone watching. Tommy appeared at their table with Alexander's Americano. "Here you go, sir," he said, placing the coffee down carefully. Then, with a glance at Zara, he added, "Ms. Johnson's drinks today are on the house. As a valued regular customer." Alexander nodded at Tommy with approval. "Thank you. At least someone here understands good business." Patricia's face contorted with embarrassment and anger. She took a step backward, nearly bumping into a nearby table. I think I'll take my coffee elsewhere today, she muttered. That might be best, Alexander agreed without looking at her. Rick, sensing that the situation had slipped completely out of his control, stepped forward again. Mr. Reynolds, it's an honor to have you in our cafe. Can I get you anything else? It's on the house, of course. Alexander looked up, his expression making it clear he wasn't impressed by the sudden change in attitude. Thank you, but I'll just have my usual coffee. He turned back to Zara. Now, why don't you tell me exactly what happened before I arrived? Don't leave anything out. As Patricia made her exit, nearly knocking over a chair in her haste, Zara took a deep breath and began to explain. Zara recounted everything that had happened, from Patricia's entrance to the manager asking her to move. As she spoke, Alexander's face grew increasingly serious. He didn't interrupt, just nodded occasionally and sipped his coffee. When she finished, Alexander set his cup down with a controlled motion that somehow seemed louder than if he had slammed it. His jaw was tight, eyes narrowed slightly at the corners. That's unacceptable, he said, his voice level but firm. Completely unacceptable. A few tables away, a group of business people who had been pretending not to listen exchanged glances. One of them, a woman with a laptop covered in stickers, gave Zara a small nod of solidarity. Alexander turned in his seat, looking for Patricia, but she had already fled the cafe. The bell above the door was still swinging slightly from her hasty exit. Instead, his gaze landed on Rick, who was hovering nervously by the counter, trying to look busy. "Excuse me," Alexander called, his voice carrying easily across the cafe. The manager froze, then slowly turned around. "I'd like a word." Rick approached their table like a man walking to his own execution. Sweat had soaked through the underarms of his blue button-up shirt. "Sir, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding," he began, the words tumbling out. "We'd value all our customers equally, and—" "That's not what your actions showed today," Alexander cut in. "Actions speak louder than words, don't they?" Rick swallowed hard. "I was just trying to keep the peace. Mrs. Whitmore can be difficult. So you decided to punish the person being harassed rather than address the person causing the problem?" Alexander asked, raising an eyebrow. The manager had no good answer for that. He looked down at his shoes. Alexander stood up, his imposing figure drawing the attention of everyone in the cafe. "Let me tell you about Zara Johnson," he said, his voice clear but not shouting. "She's the youngest director in our company's history. She graduated top of her class at MIT, turned down offers from Google and Apple to join us, and has single-handedly increased our market share by 15%. Zara felt her cheeks grow warm. She wasn't used to being the center of attention like this. But even if she were none of those things, Alexander continued, she would deserve the same respect as anyone else in this cafe. The color of someone's skin doesn't determine their worth or where they belong." An older man at a nearby table began to clap slowly. Soon, others joined in, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. The woman with the sticker-covered laptop whistled through her fingers. The applause made Rick's face turn scarlet. "Of course, sir, I completely agree. I handled this situation poorly." He turned to Zara. "Ms. Johnson, I sincerely apologize. You're always welcome here." Zara nodded, accepting his apology but not quite ready to forgive completely. She had been coming to this cafe for months, and today was the first time she'd felt unwelcome. "This isn't just about Zara," Alexander said, lowering his voice now that he had made his point. "This is about making sure your business truly welcomes everyone, not just in words but in actions." Rick nodded rapidly. "Yes, absolutely. In fact, I'd like to implement some changes immediately. Perhaps staff training and a clear policy for handling these situations in the future." Alexander seemed satisfied with this response. "That sounds like a good start." Tommy approached with fresh coffees for both of them. "I've been saying we needed something like that for months," he said, placing the cups on the table. "Some of our regulars—" He shook his head without finishing the thought. The atmosphere in the cafe had transformed. What had been tense silence was now filled with quiet conversation as customers discussed what they'd witnessed. Several people stopped by their table to express support for Zara as they left. Zara took a sip of her fresh coffee and turned back to her laptop. "So," she said to Alexander, wanting to move past the incident, You mentioned you had thoughts about the Asian market projections. Alexander smiled, recognizing her desire to focus on work rather than remain the center of attention. Yes, he said, opening his own laptop. But first, I want to say something else. Alexander closed his laptop and looked directly at Zara. What happened today isn't just about this cafe or that woman. It's about the world we live in and the world we want to create. Zara nodded, her fingers wrapped around her warm coffee cup. The early attention had faded, but the experience had left its mark. I know, she said quietly. It's not the first time something like this has happened. Probably won't be the last. That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about, Alexander replied. He leaned forward, lowering his voice so the conversation would remain between them despite the curious glances from nearby tables. I've been thinking about our company culture and how we can do better. The cafe had returned to its normal buzz of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. Outside, rain had started to fall, drawing patterns on the large front window. Horizon is growing fast, Alexander continued. We've hired 50 new people in the last quarter alone. But when I look around our offices, I don't see enough diversity. Not in our staff and not in our leadership. Zara raised an eyebrow. You know, I don't want special treatment, right? I got where I am because I earned it. Absolutely, Alexander agreed quickly. You're the most qualified person for your position, which is exactly my point. There are plenty of talented people out there who never get the chance to prove themselves because doors remain closed to them. A family with 2 small children entered the cafe, shaking raindrops from their coats. The kids laughed as they raced to a table by the window, their parents calling after them to slow down. Alexander watched them for a moment before turning back to Zara. I'd like you to help me create a new diversity and inclusion initiative at Horizon, not just the usual corporate talk, but something with real teeth to it. Zara sat up straighter, surprised. You're serious? Completely. Mentorship programs, recruitment overhauls, community outreach. Alexander counted off on his fingers. I want Horizon to lead by example, and I want you to head it up. Along with my current role? Zara asked. We'll adjust your workload accordingly, Alexander said. This is important enough to prioritize, and you're the right person to lead it. Zara felt a mix of emotions, pride at being trusted with something so meaningful, determination to make real change, and a lingering sadness that such initiatives were still necessary in this day and age. Rick approached their table again, this time with a plate of muffins. On the house, he said, setting them down. And I wanted to let you know I've just had a call with the owner. We're implementing new staff training next week, and we're updating our policy handbook. He hesitated, then added, Thank you for opening my eyes today. After Rick left, Zara picked up a blueberry muffin and broke it in half. Looks like change is already happening, even if it's small. Small changes add up, Alexander said with a smile. That's how real progress works. They spent the next hour going over the investor presentation, making small adjustments and discussing strategy. By the time they were ready to head to the office, the rain had stopped and sunlight was breaking through the clouds. As they packed up their laptops, Tommy came over once more. Just wanted to say it was nice seeing you stand your ground, Miss Johnson. My little sister wants to study computer science, and, well, seeing someone like you in a big position, it matters. Zara smiled, genuinely touched. Tell her to reach out when she's looking for internships. Horizon might have something for her. Outside the cafe, Alexander hailed a taxi for their trip to the office. You know, he said as they waited, today reminded me of something important. What's that? Zara asked. Sometimes the right person showing up at the right moment can change everything, he replied. But it shouldn't take a CEO walking in for someone to be treated with respect. Zara nodded, looking back at the cafe one last time before stepping into the taxi. No, it shouldn't. But until that day comes, we've got work to do. And as they headed toward the investor meeting, Zara felt a new sense of purpose, not just to succeed for herself, but to help create a world where no one would have to face what she had faced today.